Salam, Shalom, Peace. I'm Azra Hussain. I'm the president of the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, also known as ISBA. Welcome to ISBA's Ilm Circles workshop for April 2020. Due to the rapid spread of COVID 19, we chose to postpone the March workshop to today. For the health and safety of our community, as we work to manage our programming for the next few months, Ilm Circles will be presented online, live streaming on the fourth Tuesday of the month. Thank you for joining us this evening. We invite you to ask questions or share your comments in the comments section. Our topic today is progressive Christianity. Our presenter is the Reverend Al Gebhardt. Reverend Al Gebhardt is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, USA. As an undergraduate, he majored in voice and music education. He holds a master's degree in church and choral music from the University of Southern California and a master's degree in theology from Fuller Theological Seminary. He served two congregations in Washington State, Whitworth Community Presbyterian Church and the Redmond Presbyterian Church. For 17 years, Al was the pastor of University Presbyterian Church in Tempe, Arizona, retiring as pastor emeritus in 2009. He's chair of the Interfaith Dialogue and Program Committee, which is a part of the Theological Dialogue Commission of the Arizona Faith Network. Al is married to Betsy Wells Gebhardt. They have two daughters, Erin Wells and Anna Gebhardt. Al and Betsy live in Tempe, Arizona.
Good evening. Salam, shalom, peace to you and your family. How fun for me and how honored I am to spend these moments with you sharing something of my spiritual journey towards what some describe as progressive Christianity. I'm grateful to Azra, with whom I've worked this last 4 years as a partner on the Arizona Faith Network. And I have deep respect for all that she is doing through the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona. So let's get started. Next slide. 10 years ago, I led a group to China. And in preparation for that trip, I learned that in Mandarin, there is no definite article. For example, it's just tree. And it's tree because the tree you see today is not the tree you saw yesterday or the tree that you will see tomorrow, wasn't the one last winter or the one that will be there in the middle of the summer. The tree is continuously becoming. Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher, said, "No one steps into the same river twice, because when you step the second time, becoming." I most often refer to myself as a follower of the way of Jesus, seeking as best I can to live as he taught and as he lived. For almost 20 years now, I've been exploring a perspective called process theology, and it speaks of life as a continuous becoming. There are Muslims who use process thought. There are Jews, there are Buddhists, there are non-theists who also use this way of thinking. But tonight, I'm not speaking for any particular group. I'm only speaking for myself and for my particular spiritual journey. Next slide. Here is a picture of me as a senior in college giving my senior vocal recital. And sometimes I refer to my spiritual journey like a crescendo. Not that it's getting louder and louder, and probably through the years it's actually getting softer and softer. But if I take that symbol of a crescendo and kind of turn it on its side, it looks like two arms that are opening broader and becoming more inclusive. I grew up in a conservative Christian home, which gave me many gifts. There was a sense of God in our home. There was prayer, there was worship, there was music, there was a sense of community. But along with that, I had many questions even as a child, some of them raised by science, some of them as I thought about the existence of other religions in the world. So a lot of my journey over the years, my broadening crescendo relates to questions about these issues. Next slide. My sister said to me once, Al, why can't you just accept things? Why do you ask so many questions? Well, for good or ill, it's who I am. I'm a continuous questioner. And Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. I'm not afraid to be a questioner, not afraid that God is going to zap me because I don't have everything all settled, everything all together in my mind. It's possible, I think, to be a spiritual person, a person of faith, and still have lots of questions. Even now, during this pandemic time, perhaps especially during this time, as each of us potentially faces life-threatening potentials, we have questions. We question the meaning of our life. And there was a young man who came to Jesus one day asking many questions, and Jesus said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." So I don't fear asking questions, or don't fear not having it all together. Next slide. There's a hymn in the church that I particularly enjoy, and it goes, "The Church of Christ in every age, beset by change but spirit-led, must claim and test its heritage and keep on rising from the dead." And what that says to me is that in every age of life, in every period in human history, important discoveries have been made, and new issues have been raised. And it causes us to ask new questions. And I believe God leads us in our search. God is behind our questioning, using that search as a means of leading us to new life. So we claim the heritage we have been given, and we test it. And we may have to let go of some things that no longer make sense, so that we can reform our thinking and reform our lives. The prophet Isaiah, speaking on behalf of God, said, "Look, I am doing a new thing. Do you perceive it? Are you even willing to consider it?" And the Apostle Paul challenged his readers not to get stuck seeking to conform to the world around them, but to be continuously transformed by the renewing of their minds and their hearts, to discover what is good and what is pleasing to God in that moment. So this is what I mean by progressive Christianity, that we claim and we test and we keep on rising from the dead. Next slide. So these are a few of the considerations that I would like to address tonight, just share some of my thoughts about them. And I know any one of them could absorb our evening, but I will touch briefly on them and share with you what they mean to me in my own life. And then conclude with what the difference this makes to me. Next slide. The first has to do with my world and life view. A worldview suggested by the glasses is the lens through which I look at myself and the world. I don't think any of us comes into the world with a worldview, but it begins early, maybe even in utero, and then continues to develop through a lifetime. Next slide. I look at this young Hispanic family, particularly the baby that's being held there in the arms of its mother. What will be the influences affecting his or her worldview? Well, genetics will play a part. Our biological heredity is a given. We don't have much choice about that. We simply have to live and work with it. And then our life is filled with experiences and events that already are beginning in a mother's womb as a fetus begins to respond. And then think of all that we learn in those first 4 or 5 years through our play, through our interaction with our parents, siblings, friends, and maybe even some animals. And then our life expands significantly as we go to school and later to college or to trade school. Our arms continue to expand all of our life as we become continual learners. We experience disappointments, rejection, failures, and these have an influence on how we see the world. And then the culture that we're a part of certainly speaks to us. Is this child going to be raised in the United States or Spain or Argentina or Mexico? Where we're born certainly matters. And then think about traditions that are passed on from generation to generation through our families and through our extended family, even national traditions, and they all become a part of our perspective. And then there's spirituality or religion, or maybe no religion. A sense of being a part of something greater than ourselves and being held in a reality that gives us security and hope and peace. I mention all of these things and talk about a world and life view because we're a mixture of a lot of different elements. And I believe that God is present and a participant in each and every one of them, not just in the religious dimension. For all of life is sacred in this way, and God is encountered everywhere and in every experience. Next slide. So the question becomes, how wide do our arms reach? How much truth, how much reality are we open to embracing? Or have we already pretty much filled our box and are just about ready to close the lid? Now, none of us can take in all of it because if we could, we would be God. And along the way, we make choices. We're selective about what we take in and what we keep out. Sometimes it takes a difficult moment, a mistake, a failure, or even a deliberate evil act that we engage in to pry open our hearts and our minds so that we might consider something new and allow ourselves to be transformed in that moment. And I believe God uses all of these things in our continuous becoming. Next slide. This has been true for me in my journey. Growing up in my particular religious context, homosexuality and transgender were considered sins. Those engaging in such activity needed to repent and change. But in the middle 70s, I began to test that heritage through my own study, through my relationships with gay and lesbian people, and through the reflection of my own heart. And I came to a different conclusion than what I was given, and became an advocate for change in my particular church, and worked my whole ministry for that change. It didn't happen until after I was retired. Change came in 2013. And then in the town that I grew up in, a suburb of Chicago, there were no African Americans living in that town. What I knew about Black people, I received from television and the newspaper. And it wasn't always very positive. And early on, I developed racist perspectives that over the years I've needed to challenge. I've been working on them all these years, and some of them still haunt me and surface almost unconsciously. And then my church taught that Jesus was the only way to know God. But I began to wonder, what about those following other ways? Aren't they included in God's family? It is a deep, rich joy for me to say, to meet with people who follow other traditions and to be open to the gifts that they have to offer me. Sometimes our sharing leads to contrasts and disagreement, but there's respect and a deep knowing that we're on a similar journey together, trying to figure it all out. As Hans Kung has said, dialogue and respect among the world's religions is a necessity for world peace. Next slide. So here's one of the big issues for me: science. Most religions were founded at a time when there was a much different understanding of the world from the one that we have now. And so I've had to ask, how do I claim my heritage? How do I test it and reform it in the light of the new knowledge of science? What is the baby that I must forever protect? And what is the bathwater that I can be willing to let go of? Next slide. So take evolution. I was taught as a child in church that God created everything in 6 24-hour days and then rested on the seventh day. And now we know that the universe has been around for 13.7 billion years, and that not everything came into being all at once. Everything in our world, including us, is made of the elements of a dying star. We are organized, complex stardust. Evolution tells us that the new emerges out of the past and sometimes takes steps that can't entirely be explained by the past. So creation must have a certain amount of freedom within it, because there's been a lot of success and a lot of failure over the history of time, and it's taken 13 billion years for it to get where we are now. There seems to be purpose hidden deep within creation, because it has been moving not chaotically, but towards greater and greater complexity. There's something known as the anthropic principle that speaks of the fine-tuning of many variables that are absolutely necessary for human beings to exist. I believe that God works within creation, calling it out of chaos into an ordered cosmos, luring it in its development towards greater value and beauty. There would not be evolution, in my view. There would not be life without God. Next slide. And then there's quantum physics. Amazing, intriguing, weird, extremely important new science. And don't worry, I don't really know very much about it. But what I do know is that its discovery has radically changed how we understand that the universe is put together. For millennia, we thought that the universe was made up of tiny bits of matter or substances. And the tiniest bit of matter is called an atom. There was nothing smaller than an atom. And then along comes quantum physics, and now we know that beneath the atom there are subatomic elements like electrons and protons and neutrons and quarks. And that the universe is not made of matter at all. It's made of continuously moving and interacting electrical energy. We used to think we could figure out how everything would act, potentially. If something bumped into something else, well, in the Newtonian view, we could figure that out, what would happen. But now we know that we cannot determine every outcome, that there are intricacies of the universe that will never be known. We could know possibilities. It might be from here or to there, but perhaps not exactly what is going to take place. So there's a certain amount of indeterminacy that we now know is built into the universe. And that's got to be humbling. We used to think that objects are influenced only by direct contact. And now we know that particles can be instantly affected by other particles, even at great distances from each other. And this opens up a whole weird world of the psychic and the paranormal, and perhaps even allows us to think in new ways about prayer, that our prayers, when looked at within the quantum world, can have some effect on the one we're praying for, even at a distance. Next slide. Chief Seattle had some inkling of this, I think, over 100 years ago. Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. Next slide. And Martin Luther King observed that we are caught in an inescapable web of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, so that whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can imagine God is part of this web. Maybe God is that inescapable quantum web that connects us all and the whole universe together. The spirituality that I've come to affirm at its center is relational. Next slide. So, how do we perceive God? And how do we think God relates to creation? Next slide. Here are 4 possibilities. The one in the upper right sees God and creation entirely separate. God wound up the universe at the beginning, set it free to run like a clock, and now keeps distance from creation. And then the second view on the right, now that first view is known as the deist view. And the second view perceives God and creation as one. They are the same. There's no separation, nothing more, nothing beyond. And that is a pantheist view. And then the view on the lower right, perhaps is a more traditional view that understands God creating everything at the beginning, setting up natural law for it basically to run on its own. But God then intervenes now and then to control outcomes, to accomplish divine purposes. This is the view that I was taught and that many Christians espouse. But there's one more perspective that makes greater sense to me right now, and it's called panentheism. And it's not a mistake that it's the bigger picture on the screen. But in this view, God is hidden within creation, and creation exists within God. But God is greater than creation. It's a relational perspective that sees God vitally connected with everything. Next slide. Think of a developing fetus in its mother's womb. It's a distinct entity, already acting, already responding on its own. But it exists within the mother and cannot live without her. So we are in God, and God is in us. And our life depends on God. Or how about fish in the ocean, each a separate entity existing within the life-giving water that surrounds it and that permeates each cell of its body. The psalmist wrote that there's no place to go and God not to be present. Can't go up in the heavens, not down in the depths of the earth, not even into the darkness. God is there. And the psalmist says, "You know me completely, O God, even my thoughts. You are always present with me." And the Apostle Paul, quoting a Greek philosopher, said that we live and move and have our being in God. Scripture often pictures God as the breath that we breathe, the air that surrounds us. As we breathe and draw in through the systems of our body, it eventually reaches each cell of our body with the elements of life. God is as close to us as the air we breathe. Next slide. Theologian Sally McFaig put it this way: the world, the universe, is the body of God. All matter, all flesh, all myriad beings, things, and processes that constitute physical reality are in and of God. Next slide. A 19th century poet, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, put it this way: earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who takes off his shoes sees. The rest sit round and pluck berries. I'm sorry, I said, but only he who sees takes off his shoes, and the rest sit round and pluck blackberries. An important part of my spiritual journey and the broadening of my perspective has been in a new way of seeing creation, not just as the handiwork of God, but as containing the presence of God, so that I experience God in the wonder and the diversity and the beauty of creation. Next slide. I was going to say something about what's on this slide, but I've decided instead to read something. There's a wonderful musical that was put together by Paul Winter. It's called Misagea, and there's a piece in there called Mystery. And this sort of says what I'm trying to say. And of course, mystery is a reference to God. It lives in the sea or a tree as it grows. You can hear it if you listen to the wind as it blows. It's there in a river as it flows to the sea. It's the sound of a soul, of someone becoming free. And it lives in the laughter of children at play, and in the blazing sun that gives light to the day. It moves the planets and the stars that shine. It's been the mover of mountains since the beginning of time. But when I listen deep inside, I feel best of all, like a moon that's glowing white, and I listen to your call, and I know you will carry me. I feel like the tide rushing through the ocean, and my heart is open wide. Oh, mystery, you are alive. I feel you all around. You are the fire in my heart. You are the holy sound. You are all of life. It is to you that I sing. Grant that I may feel you always in everything. Next slide. So how does God relate to me? Well, sometimes I imagine it's like my GPS. God has a vision or a potential destiny, as it were, for my life, who I might become. And God comes to me in a variety of ways, saying, Al, turn here, go this way. But perhaps I'm preoccupied and I just don't even notice the turn. Or I don't like the way that way seems to be going. So I prefer to stick with my own way and keep going, not taking the turn. But God does not give up. God never gives up on us. This is my view. God recalculates and comes to me again and say, Al, here's another possibility. You can get there if you take this one. Let's try it. And so God offers me another chance and another chance and another chance to choose life. It is an ongoing process of becoming. Next slide. And sometimes I think of God's relating to me like playing in a jazz ensemble. And maybe as the piece got started, the theme of love has already been set, and many others have offered their take on it. And I have heard their riffs. They're stored there in my head. They're part of my experience. But then it comes the moment for me to add something. And I hear a slightly different take, and a different riff comes to mind, and I improvise in my own way and make my own contribution, creating something new in that moment that has never been played before. I see God as that lure to creativity and novelty, and that we together as a jazz ensemble, each offering their gift, each offering their particular riff, always in a process of together creating the music of love and justice and peace. Next slide. A friend of mine, a theologian, simply puts it this way: God takes the world as it is. God takes my world as it is and continuously calls it to what it can be. God meets us in our particular context with a call to new transforming possibilities. That is how I see God's love for me, continuously trying to lead me to new life, new possibilities. Next slide. So I follow Jesus because he is for me the fullest revelation of what God intends for my life. I'm not trying to live his life. My context, my world is much different from his 2,000 years ago. But I seek to respond to God's call in a similar way as I think he did. Next slide. I see Jesus as a human being like you and me, that he grew in knowledge and wisdom like you and I do, and that he heard God calling him like we can hear God calling us, and that he adopted a prophetic vision, drawing from Isaiah the prophet. He would seek to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, freedom to the oppressed, and declare God's favor to all. So Azra is asking, well, how does your conservative family feel about your inclusive path? Well, I'm one of few in my family that would espouse the kind of approach to spirituality and to Christianity that I'm suggesting this evening. And so I continue to reach out and I continue to have discussions, but I have to say that more often than not now, I kind of zip my lips. There are some things that only lead to disagreement, and that's just the way it is. And Penny, do you believe, let's see, I can't, hold on. I can't continue, I can't entirely get your question because there's something on my screen that's covering it up. I'll come back to it.
Do you believe that God is luring us to something in the current chaos? What might that be?
In the what chaos?
The current chaos.
Oh. Well, I'm going to cover that a little bit more when I deal with the section on evil and suffering. And so, Penny, I think if I could just wait till I get there and then come back to your question, if that would be all right. Let me go back again to Jesus and to thinking about what he did. I don't know if that's the next slide, Joe. Maybe it is. Jesus chose love as his highest goal, even above keeping sacred laws, and that got him into some trouble. He taught with wisdom, using parables that were often challenging to his listeners, like when he pointed to the despised Samaritan as an example of someone who offered compassionate care, or when he spoke of a loving father throwing a party for a despicable prodigal son. Jesus welcomed the unwelcome, children, women, lepers, the poor, the outcasts. He challenged people to take new steps of becoming, like when he invited a rich man to share his wealth, or when he sort of was in the face of religious snobs, challenging their hypocrisy, or when he confronted political authorities to recognize their oppressive ways. So some of these things are what have drawn me to Jesus, although I have to say, that was a part of the context, the tradition, the culture that I grew up in. If I had been born someplace else, I might very well have started off in a different religious path. But the next slide. Jesus proposed a way to live that pointed towards love as the greatest of all commandments. And when I say I follow the way of Jesus, here's what kind of comes to my mind. He said that our lives are like seeds that need to die first in order to live. That our journey is one of losing life in order to gain it, of taking up a cross and engaging in some risky pursuit that we can't let go of. It's one of continual death and resurrection, and he lived the way he taught, even when he knew it would lead to crucifixion. We see his way lived out in people of our time, people like Mother Teresa and people like Martin Luther King, and many who I think today are risking their lives out of something deep within them that says, I need to be there. I need to help these people who are suffering. I am going to put my life at risk in order to love. Next slide. A lot of people heard and responded to Jesus. Maybe there were too many because he became a threat to religious and political authorities. And some thought that it would be better to get rid of one person than to lose the nation. But Jesus would not be deterred. And he prayed, not my will, but yours be done, even when his enemies were in that very moment preparing to kill him. Then something amazing happened. After his death, his disciples sensed his presence with them, and they shared that they even encountered him as if risen to new life. And they celebrated his presence in holy rituals and meals, as many Christians do today. But here's the thing. I don't think that it is my belief in Jesus that transforms my life. And I don't believe that Jesus had to die. Rather, it is the faithfulness of Jesus that touches me the most deeply. It is his love, no matter the cost, that reaches me and invites me to follow in that same way. Somehow it resonates in the deepest part of who I am. Next slide. All right, now we're approaching this question about evil and suffering. And it's one of the big issues that has been a significant question for me and about which I have changed my perspective. How can an all-loving and an all-powerful God allow so much suffering? And just a few reminders. Next slide. Remember the tsunami in 2004. It devastated many shore communities in Asia. Began with an earthquake in Indonesia, sent a tidal wave all the way to East Africa. 228,000 people died, and homes and villages destroyed. And I remember some sharing that they thought that they survived, but their neighbor didn't, because they were of one faith tradition and their neighbor was of a different faith tradition, as if God played favorites. Next slide. A few blocks from our home, several years ago, a mom and her two children were crossing a busy arterial, and the walk light was on, but a driver was distracted, failed to stop, hit all three, killing the mom. Couldn't God have done something to prevent this tragedy? Two young people, young children, losing their mom. Next slide. And how about Sandy Hook school tragedy in 2012? A 20-year-old enters an elementary school, kills 26 and 7-year-old children and 6 adults. There have been pleas for changes in gun laws made even by parents of the children who died, but so far, very few, if any, laws and policies have changed. Next slide. And then there is this horrific virus, over 3 million cases. Now 213,000 deaths, 57,000 in the United States. We find ourselves, as we watch the broadcast, suffering with those who are suffering and those who are seeking to respond and offer their care and support. And we live with our own fears, and we hope for change for the better and for a vaccine that might be helpful to all of us. So where is God in all of this? Next slide. Remember Rabbi Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He and his wife had a child that had an aging illness called progeria. The son died at 14 years old as an old man. And he shared a number of reasons that were given to him why God, why this might be happening and how he should respond. Well, these reasons didn't work for Rabbi Kushner, and I doubt they would work for me either if I lost a child or a spouse tragically in a shooting or a tornado. or a pandemic. Next slide. So here are some of my thoughts, and maybe this will address your question, Penny. Jesus said that the sun shines on bad and good people alike, and that the rain falls on the just and the unjust. God doesn't play favorites, in my view. And creation has a certain level of freedom that I've already mentioned, and within that, stuff happens. Sometimes the earth shakes, and pain and suffering occur. And sometimes people choose to do very evil things that result in the loss and deep grief to others. I believe God has great power, but God does not have all the power. Creation also has power. You and I and other people have power. And I believe that God is love, and that love by its very nature is not coercive or controlling. I don't think God manufactures these things to teach us lessons or bring us to some higher good. So I think there are some things God couldn't prevent the crucifixion of Jesus. But there are things that I think God can do, and I believe that God does do. I believe God suffers with us. God knows at a depth even beyond our own pain and our own grief. And we know and feel divine suffering in the empathetic and compassionate love of others. They become God's suffering heart to us. As the scripture even records that Jesus wept when he heard that his friend Lazarus had died. And then second, I think God works in many ways for our healing and a return to wholeness in the midst of tragedy and suffering. I think God is at work in many lives and in the world in terms of what's going on with this pandemic. And then last, I do believe that God calls forth new life even out of death. And that's the meaning of resurrection for me. It is not that God causes suffering. I don't believe that. It is that God uses our painful moments to draw us to new life. I think of some of those Sandy Hook parents as examples of those who have since become advocates for change in gun purchase laws. Would they choose to do this for that end? Of course not. They would rather have their child back with them. But in the midst of such tragedy, God calls forth transformation. The Apostle Paul wrote that in all things God works for good. Not that all things are good, as those who advised Rabbi Kushner might have thought, but rather that God is able to bring good even out of the most tragic moments. So I remember, I'll share the fact that I went through a divorce a number of years ago. And I said to myself, if I'm going to go through the pain and anguish of this, and it was the most difficult period of my life, I am going to get the benefit of it. And what I meant by that is, Al, what is there in this moment, in this experience, that you can learn that can transform your life, that can make you a better person? So hopefully our country, our nation, our leaders will take stock and say, what can we learn out of this? And many people in their personal situation are going to be having to look at that same situation, the same possibility. Not that it would necessarily come to them quickly and easily, but over time, perhaps some good can come out of a really tragic situation. Next slide. So, what difference does all of this make for me? Next slide. One of the differences is that I see God all around me. Since I believe God is hidden within creation, I'm now looking for God everywhere. And when I'm intentional about it, I'm usually rewarded. A wonderful pet. 8 grapefruits sitting on the end of a tree in our backyard, all in a little branch. A trumpet vine opening to the sun in the front of our house. A college friend playing, improvising on his flute. Native American hoop dancers down at the herd, sharing their talent and their spirituality. Colleagues gathered at the Tempe Mosque, a time of with children in worship, or meeting strangers in a foreign land. An amazing moon a month ago that was just simply awe-inspiring. And a loving, compassionate wife who journeys with me and not only cares about me and most often for me, but cares for moms and new babies at the hospital. So we don't have to look very far to see God present, hidden in the beauty and the truth and the love that is all around us. And next slide. I hear God regularly calling me to take up my cross and follow. I think of what motivates a Bill Gates to want to cure the world of malaria, HIV, and the coronavirus. Where did Martin Luther King's dream come from to rid our country of racism and poverty? What moves a Muslim woman to share her wedding dress with young girls who can't afford to buy one? Why would a talented midlife woman with a husband and family to be concerned about step forward to declare her commitment to ministry, the ministry of Christ? I believe that God has spoken, but I believe that God is still speaking. And my task is to listen and then to join with others to discern in this moment what God may be calling us to. Next slide. And last, if God doesn't have all the power, and if love doesn't coerce or control, then God can't accomplish all that God would like to accomplish in this world without my help. God needs me, in some senses dependent on me to be God's eyes and ears and God's hands and feet to fulfill God's vision for the world. God simply can't do it without the small part that I can play. And so the last slide. Joe, is it possible to make that slide bigger for me so that I can see it Well, it's a slide that simply says, "Will you come and follow me if I but call your name? Will you go where you don't know and never be the same? Will you let my love be shown? Will you let my name be known? Will you let my life be grown in you and you in me? In your company I'll go where love and footsteps show. Then I'll move and live and grow in you and you in me." So that pretty much says how I see myself as a progressing or processing Christian, continuously being called of God, continuously becoming a new creation. Thanks for spending this time with me and allowing me to share these thoughts with you. May God be with each and every one of you. Good night.
Thank you, Reverend Gebhardt, and thank you to all who were able to join us this evening. This program is sponsored in part by Dr. Meraj Mohyuddin. He provides the gift to our guest speakers. His gift is the book that he's written, Revelation, the Story of Muhammad. You can listen to his series based on this book on YouTube on his channel. ISBA is a nonprofit organization and depends on financial support from the community. Please help us bring more programs like the one you experienced tonight by donating generously to ISBA. Our next Ilm Circles workshop will be on Tuesday, May 26th, 2020 at 6 p.m. right here, live on Facebook and YouTube. The topic is Understanding the Quran, and our guest presenter will be Dr. Nadia Katunji. Until then, stay safe and healthy. Good evening.